It's Thursday, July 22nd today. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who are listening in from great communities around the world. Welcome to Axiom News Live, where we start with what's strong, not with what's wrong, where we engage strengths and catalyze change. My name's Peter Pula. I'm our lead host today. I'm joining you from Chelsea, Quebec, Canada. And today I have as my guests David LePage of Bisocial Canada, who's got breaking news on some major shifts in the world of a social value marketplace and what that means for social enterprises in this nation. And Laurie Mcintrye from Jaycee Homes in Brantford, Ontario, who is part of a citizen-led initiative to bring tiny homes and accessory dwellings into community as a response to the housing crisis in Brantford, Ontario. But before we hear from our guests, I would like to share some of what's news in our network. I'll share a few headlines. This time they are from topics of inquiry that generative journalists around the world, and at Axiom News, we consider ourselves founding members of the generative journalism movement. We use a process called topics of inquiry, where we stay as a group of journalists in our community for a long period of time with some questions and generative questions to follow. In our network now are the following around the world topics of inquiry. What if we all took a person-centered, strength-based approach to our lives, our approach to life and work? What if belonging Brant became a center of possibility in our community? What if worker-directed and worker-owned organizations became the norm? What if we could support each other to connect, heal, and build power through story? And what if neighborhoods across the world could share knowledge and learn from each other to build powerful commons right where they are? Imagine how many stories there are like this out there. We need only to look and see. With that, I'd like to invite our guests, David LePage and Laurie Mcintrye, to join us. Welcome, David and Laurie. Good to see you. I've had the pleasure of knowing you both for, well, David, I think, my goodness, 15 years, 20 years now, always each of us dabbling in some step towards better community, and Laurie for a year or so now, but I've never had the pleasure of being in the same room with both of you. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
How are you coming in? How are you feeling?
Well, I'm in Vancouver, and we moved from January 2 days ago with a high of 12 to June today with getting into the 20s. So it's quite pleasant today.
Right on. You're looking good?
Staying healthy.
Right on. And Laurie, how are you feeling? How are you coming in?
I'm excited. This is a new experience for me, so I'm looking forward to seeing what unfolds.
Right on. Okay. We had discussed in the green room that we'd sort of had a plan to hear first from David and then from Laurie, but then I realized that there's actually quite a transition to be made and quite an interesting possible flow and connection between the things that the both of you are working on. So we decided we would hang out together and see what unfolds from very high level policy shifts that David's been working steadfastly on with his crew at Bisocial Canada for, I think you said 9 years now, David, after you made a pivot towards social procurement. And then Laurie, who has an interest in social enterprises, the implications for what David has to share with us for social enterprises across the country are pretty far reaching. So we might dance a little bit in that intersection. And then Laurie and I are part of a small group in, well, it's growing. There are now 90 people in Tiny Homes Working Circle in Brant and Brantford, working to create community capacity for the build of tiny homes and accessory dwellings as a response to the housing crisis there. So we'll talk a little bit not only about progress on that front, but also the way in which we're going about that is a little different than many approaches. So that's sort of our run of show for today. David, maybe we can begin with you and I connected a little bit a couple days ago and you shared with me that some big milestones are coming in the world of social procurement in Canada. Can you speak into what's shifted lately, and we'll move from there into sort of what's the implications might be.
Yeah, I think it's pretty fascinating, Peter. And when you mentioned, we've been working together for a number of years. I was actually writing up a report for something the other day, and to give it some context, I actually had to put it in a bit of historical context. Even though the report was, "What did you do this year?" And it was like, well, we did this stuff this year, but it really was. Uh, it was one of those theory of change. What's your outputs? What's your outcomes? And all that. And I'm like, okay, none of that.
Sounds riveting.
Well, I thought so.
Right. Okay. Good.
And I was trying to put it in context for the people who'd be reading it, because they're going to read it as like a snapshot, right? And I realized it's not a snapshot. It's like really an extended, dialogue that goes back to those years that you were talking about. Like it was 20 years ago, when I was working a lot in social enterprise, that we realized that nothing was going to happen significantly um, in social enterprise unless we had people buying from social enterprises. So the jobs weren't going to be created. The sales of indigenous art weren't going to happen unless people were buying. So that's when
A demand side problem.
yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
so we had to learn how that worked. And it was 9 years ago, in 2014, we founded Buy Social Canada. And at that point, I met with someone from the federal government, and who works in Public Service Procurement Canada, the ministry that buys everything, like $23 billion a year of goods and services. And I said, you guys should be doing social procurement, because over here you got these ministries that are trying to solve homelessness and trying to create jobs for people facing barriers and integrate new immigrants, address indigenous issues. And you could do that all with how you buy things if you intentionally add the social value. And he looked at me and he said, to make that change would take 10 years, David. So, Peter, 9 years.
I remember, I think I was sitting at a table with you at a conference in London, and you
That
had
was
just made the shift to
2017.
social procurement. And I remember having lunch and thinking, looking at my watch, going, social procurement just does not sound sexy or fun. But you sort of, I think you'd laid down your track at that point and
Yeah.
set
And I,
on the path.
and I think the remarkable thing is that now the federal government, along with a whole lot of, municipalities like Peterborough, Wood Buffalo, Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, et cetera, have, especially for the federal government, to move from we buy from lowest price to say we buy for best value. That's a huge shift. And we're talking, and we've talked before about this thing called the Overton window, which is that policy window that we work in. That's a comfortable place for government to work. And I think that's the biggest shift. It's now a comfortable place to talk about when we spend money as government. It's not just about how do we get what we need as the lowest cost, but how do we create the greatest value? So if you're in a municipality, it's not just about collecting the taxes, but how do we reinvest the taxes to create jobs, to create a healthy local economy, to create, you all this pressure right now on, like, municipalities and institutions like Amazon showing up and saying, "Whoa, you should just contract with us. We'll do all your buying for you." Well, what happens to that small, like,
Mm-hmm.
your former hometown of Peterborough, without the buying from the local office, family-owned office supply company? They're gone, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we start to look now, and I think this is a big shift, Peter. It's like people are understanding the ramifications and implications of purchasing decisions, right? Because there's always an impact. It's a social value, there's an economic value, there's a cultural value, environmental. They all happen. And I think we're seeing now institutions and governments saying, wow, it's not just you as a consumer, Peter, going to the grocery store and buying organic carrots. It's like, oh my God, this is like billions of dollars a year that can actually shift the market from being this, just based on economic transactions to actually transforming communities. And when you talk about the work you're doing, and that's why I think the uh, collision between our activities keeps happening,
Mhm,
because
mhm, mhm.
it's really, whether it's from the journalism, the storytelling, it's about that, using what we're doing to build community. So you, rather than, you think of how your effort around journalism is shifting from, these are not, we're not chasing ambulances and just looking at,
Or
the
celebrity,
price.
or you're at
Right.
corner office news, or
I
yeah.
mean, someone posted a great piece last night about, all the efforts now to save these 6 people who are in that little submarine, and it's the headlines everywhere.
Mhm,
And someone
mhm,
posted on social media, it's like, there's a lot of people missing in the streets.
mhm.
And we think about the missing women and girls in indigenous communities, and we talk about people, and if we did the same global effort on some of those other issues. And I think that's why, for me, it's about the economy, the marketplace is there. We're always going to trade. Indigenous communities traded for thousands of years before the Europeans came, in a very healthy way.
Right.
They
Like,
traded.
trade's not a bad thing. Trade's a good thing if it's fair trade and done well and with
And
real reciprocity.
exactly,
Yeah.
Peter. And if we can redesign or go back and take those lessons from the indigenous communities and put those values into how we trade, that's going to change the outcomes of our communities. You think
And
about
so there's
the environmental stewardship, you think of extraction.
right. Well, I've come to understand from you that with social procurement, what we're shifting is what you said earlier was the best value for the dollar, so to speak, and it was very economic. But what you've done is you've developed and embellished the criteria for purchasing. And what that means is that when a government agency or a municipality or even a corporation who's working on a government project or with government funding will be required to now take that wider matrix of effects into consideration in the purchase process. And I think that what that means is that um, organizations that are employing or hiring people on the margins who have barriers to employment are now going to see more projects, more purchases done that create those kinds of jobs and those kinds of opportunities for them to step into the marketplace. So there's this, I think that's one of the things I've liked about very much about your approach, David, is that you're a very practical person. So we watch news of the world, and it's distant and far away and a bit repetitive, and it freaks us out, but there's not really anything we can do about it, and it's not really close to home. In the meantime, we know that there's homelessness. We know that there are untold numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We know that people are doing some things about some of these things on the ground, but we don't hear about it. So, what we need is these practical pathways to create possibility around local initiative. And to me, that's part of what you've managed to do with social procurement is you're creating a marketplace for social enterprises that are solving some of the problems and approaching some of the possibilities on the ground and in our communities. Now, you said your colleague said 10 years. And from what I can gather, it took 7 years to get the policies changed. And now it's 2 years later, and we're into implementation. Can you
Yeah,
say
it's
something about
quite.
that?
Yeah, it's quite. Actually, this month, Peter, the federal government puts out their first 2 requests for proposals that have specifically social value considerations in them. Um, there's one of the biggest contracts, or a very big contract the federal government does, is to clean and maintain all their buildings. You can imagine what that contract is worth, right? Billions of dollars. Right now, the federal government is putting out what are called requests for information, which is kind of like checking out the marketplace, who's going to bid, what should our request for
Okay.
proposal look like. And it's fascinating to see the RFI, the request for information that came out last week, number 2, included, we are going to require social value and indigenous value outcomes in this contract. So the language is shifting enough, Peter, that what happens is, even in, it's not just the social enterprises, they're part of that scheme because they have in my mind, the best value. But what's happening is now no one's going to win that contract to manage all that cleaning unless you're a huge property manager, right?
Right.
You're talking the CBREs, the BGISs, the billion-dollar companies. But what you're doing and signaling to them is you're not going to win this contract unless you're working with social enterprise and indigenous suppliers. So it's using the marketplace to drive down and to change the behavior, because the policy is nice. And we know a lot of municipalities have policy, but no behavior change. Now we're getting into,
Mm-hmm.
from the policy to, okay, we put it in some requests for proposals, we put it in some contracts. Now we're starting to see it's actually shifting the behavior and the attitudes of the companies who want to win those contracts. So what becomes a contract compliance requirement then all of a sudden starts to say, well, this is a good value. We work
Mm-hmm.
with one company that no one had ever asked them, Peter, what good do you do? They've only asked for 100 years. This company said, we only got asked, like, what do you have the best price and can you get this done? And a really a valuable company doing great things, family owned, treated everyone well, paid good, all those good things you want to see in a company. But no one ever said, what do you bring to this project
Right.
besides price?
And that itself might even bring some awareness of things they are already doing that tend in that direction, but haven't necessarily been acknowledged or seen as something that could be appreciated and developed.
Exactly, Peter. I think what we're starting to recognize is that there are a lot of valuable businesses that have been doing amazing work. But if you only said, give us price, we're not asking about, do you pay a living wage? Do you have a training program that includes diverse, employees? What's your diversity, equity, and inclusion thing? Do you buy locally? um, what's your relationship with your suppliers? So now we start to value those things. The companies that are doing good are going to get more value, more opportunities for contracts. But we also start to invite others to say, okay, you could pay a living wage and you'll get more
Right.
points.
Right. Right.
So as we start to make the shift from just transaction to transformative procurement, we have to change the behavior of the entire marketplace, because
Right.
you need
Right.
the purchasers shifting and you need suppliers shifting. And then social enterprises who are built on the design of, we have a social value, we reinvest our profits back into the community. Then you're saying, oh, that's a good thing. And they're no longer on the margins. They actually become like,
Right.
get the value that they're offering. Because when you start to weight your technical skills, your competitive pricing, your social value, and your environmental impact, when you buy, you're shifting the marketplace. Because for 300 years now, it's just been, who can give me the lowest price for what I
Mm-hmm.
need?
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
that's the behavior the market was driving, right?
Right. So you're shifting the context in which we're doing business. So what you said is that the federal government of Canada is now putting out requests for information. So sort of getting a feel for the
And and
field.
and some requests for proposals.
Okay.
They're starting on their implementation path. I mean,
Okay.
it's a
And so
big,
what
you
I
know,
understand is that down the road, that'll also mean that federal funding to municipal projects, for example, will also include some of these
yeah,
parameters. Is that right?
it already has a policy in place called the Community
Okay.
Employment Benefits that
Okay.
on major infrastructure projects, when the federal government contributes, there is this policy that they all agreed to in 2018. And now that is being looked at. It's like, okay, we've got a policy in place. How do we implement it? Which is, again, a whole new thing to think about. Like you're building, you would know in Ottawa, like a big rail system. And it's like
Hmm.
it was built on price and quality. The next time it happens, like,
Neither of those two things worked out at all, actually. Price or quality. So the model's broken. Thank God David LePage is here to set it straight.
so at least, and if it had been different, we'd at least had some social value on it.
Well, exactly. Something right would have got
Well,
done
but
with the
if you
money.
sit on the
Yeah, yeah.
train long enough, well, it stopped and not going anywhere, Peter.
Right, right,
Some social
right,
value might be created
right,
um,
right.
by
So
accident.
there's another element there in when the social procurement policies and practices start to roll out, that there's the possibility that there aren't enough social enterprises to meet that need.
Yeah, but I
Not that
think
need, but to meet that demand. Is that a
absolutely,
possibility? Yeah.
absolutely, and that's to say it's sort of a marketplace issue that if we don't reward that kind of value, it's not going to grow. Right? So now, when you start to say there's a value if you are a social enterprise and you're bidding on this contract, more companies are going to say, I'd like to be a social enterprise or I would like to meet this criteria. We're seeing it in the city of Calgary that has now been watching. They do a social value questionnaire on every request for proposal. And they don't watch just who wins, but they're actually watching who's applying, right? So they're
Mm-hmm,
seeing the
mm-hmm.
shift of more companies saying, "Oh, I can meet these
That's a
social
bit of
values."
asset mapping, I guess. You're seeing in that process who else is out there that you might cultivate and grow into a richer
Right.
marketplace, I suppose,
So,
of suppliers. Yeah.
and when you give 10% value like they do for social value, if price and quality are pretty equal, the 10% is going to drive it to the social value business.
Right.
And in Calgary, 53% of all the winning bids last year were the business with the highest social value. So that's
Right
showing
on.
you that the
Wow.
competition for quality and price is really close. But over half of the winning bids were the best value from a social perspective. So
Beautiful.
as we learn and see that evidence, and then more businesses start to adapt that, we're not going to have we don't have enough businesses. It's going to
Right.
open up markets and opportunities.
Right.
We're seeing it here at like the new St. Paul's, which is a $2.5 billion hospital build. Well, there's not social enterprises that build hospitals, but there are
Mm-hmm.
social
Mm-hmm.
enterprises that do things like clean construction trailers, that provide the food for the workers, that can do the temporary labor like embers. So it's a re education of the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. And a reorientation.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's all those pieces together. It's a huge systems shift of what are
And
the value.
you're a year early because your
I think
colleague
we're
told you 10 years and you're at 9.
on on some aspects. Now we've got the next 10 to implement it, right, Peter? What Mark,
And I just
Mark,
bring that to share that, sometimes it takes persistence and consistency and constancy of effort and commitment to make these things happen. But there is hope because 9 years ago, this was a long road and you've walked it. And look at where we are now.
yeah, a lot of players in this. You know what I'm saying? It's like when you look at what some of the work like it's going on like in Winnipeg with, the social enterprises working with the city and with the chamber and with construction association to change the city's purchasing. You look at what Toronto Community Benefits Network is doing with Metrolinx and with the unions in Toronto
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
diversify the workforce. Um, it's really, to me, Buy Social Canada has tried to be like a catalyst or a convener around these issues, but
Two of my favorite words, David: catalyst and convener.
so somehow we keep coming back to the same things. But that's really, we just had our staff retreat a few weeks ago, and we pulled up the original design of what Buy Social Canada was about doing, and it's fascinating that one of the first things we talked about doing was the advocacy, the education, that
Mm.
and to catalyze the discussion. So now
Till the
it's like,
ground, till the soil,
yeah.
prepare the conditions. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So now the next challenge is really, how do we do exactly what you're talking about? How do we build the social enterprises to be capable and have the capacity, the financing, the business acumen to take advantage of the market opportunities? How do we create the relationships between those corporations that are going to be subcontracting? How do we make sure government does evaluate for all the outcomes? Because it would be pretty easy to say it didn't work, because it's not going to work in the first 6 months.
Right,
Oh,
right,
it's like,
right.
and if you're a transactional procurement
It's not
person,
going to work for the first
right,
6 months, everyone. So just sit down and be patient.
check in with
Settle
Peter,
down, settle down.
And David in 10 years. And
Yeah, yeah. Well, how about every couple of months or so?
okay.
So I just want to sort of bridge a little bit, and I'll presume maybe too much. But so, Laurie, I know that you're uh, with Jaycee Homes. You house, in particular, women, and you have an interest in creating social enterprises that might provide spaces for them to flourish and to grow. And one of my thoughts. So I also wonder, David, if or Laurie, if you have any sense for whether the municipality in Brantford is contemplating social procurement at all, and or if there are builds that might have federal money attached in the area that there might be social procurement um, conditions on. Because one of the things I've also learned from you, David, is that a large contractor or a builder, for example, could hire a small social enterprise to do some part of the work to meet the criteria. So you don't necessarily have to get the contract to build the hospital, as you've said, but you could get the contract to catering, cleaning, landscaping, things that are bite-sized pieces that could still be revenue enough to build skills
Yeah,
and a social enterprise that works in community.
and it's not always driven by government requirements, Peter. I think we have to
Okay.
recognize that companies like SAP, software company, has said 5% of our buy is going to be from social enterprises by
Right. Right.
2025.
Right.
Shandos has made the same, a construction company. They're looking at it not just that we have to do it because of government opportunities. I think we're seeing
Right. Right.
government opportunities as a key lever, but you're starting to see corporations and businesses who are saying, we want to keep our employees. We want to have a reputation in the community. We have a commitment to our shareholders, to our owners, to our communities we work in, to be as inclusive as possible. So we're going to start looking for, is there a Black owned business that could do this? Is there a local business? Is there a social enterprise? Is there an Indigenous business? I'm not just going to do what I've done, and it's it's their
Well, I think
changing
there
it.
are marvels that never marvels and wonders that never cease when you can bring folks into an organization who are different than most of the folks in the organization. I mean, this just sort of develops the culture, develops awareness, opens up new vistas of perception and relationship. Like there's all kinds of really wonderful cultural reasons to do this kind of thing as well. So what you've set up in terms of some of these catalysts is just might invite more folks into that kind of experience.
And you start to see that in different sectors in industry, people want to be the best, right?
Right. Right.
And so we actually use at times the capitalist system to
Sure.
create the right behavior because it's like, oh, if I can get this contract by being better at this, I'm going to be better at that because it helps my bottom line. Well, eventually, though, hopefully, it's not just the bottom line, but it becomes the culture of the corporation.
Right. Right.
And and as more corporations, more everybody becomes the marketplace becomes more conscious beyond just the consumer level. We start to look at the marketplace not as this place of competition and capitalism, but we
Right.
start to
Right.
look at the marketplace as that's how we grow community. I mean,
Mhm.
So I'm wondering, Laurie, to what degree does the presumptions I've made, are they anywhere near accurate to kind of what you'd like to see happen, or um,
I honestly think, like, I don't think the conversation is really happening about that right now, about social procurement, right? I
in your
think,
community?
yeah,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
I'm hearing. I feel like it's not being discussed, or not at any levels that I'm in anyways.
Right.
But I
Right.
feel, as I'm listening to you speak, David, I think, so many organizations, so many companies, corporations probably down deep want that social impact, but the conversations aren't happening and the competitive level is the bottom line. So I love that, if the more we're increasing this conversation, the more that the benefit is being shown. I think that, this conversation is going to grow, and it's going to be part of the norm when you're, have an RFP, and that social impact is going to be, you know, a large score in the bottom line, right? So,
And I think
but
that
I
was
yeah.
part of. I think that was part of the reason you're going about policy change too, right, David? Is so that where these conversations aren't being happening or aren't being had naturally, this sort of thing's going to show up on folks' doorstep, and it's going to press the conversation. It's going to
well,
require it to be had.
and we actually have seen the most successful municipal shifts to social procurement have come and have been driven by community. So in Calgary,
Okay.
it started with Momentum, a CED group. In Peterborough, it started with the immigrant, service
Mm-hmm.
group going
Mm-hmm.
to one counselor and saying, you should look at this, who then took it to council, who took it to mayor. And now it's in Winnipeg. If it hadn't been for the social enterprise sector, pushing this and convening the Chamber of Commerce and convening and raising the issue, it wouldn't have happened in Winnipeg. So I think we have to look at the power of what community has done to drive these changes, right? In Vancouver, when it started, 20 years ago, it was really the social enterprises in the downtown east side saying, wait a minute, what are you doing to support and change the issue? So I think it has to come most often to be successful. It comes from community. So Laurie, you just have to make a couple phone calls this afternoon.
I'm totally inspired. Totally inspired. It's funny because, when I'm talking about the social enterprise that I'd like to create, you get the feedback I usually get is, oh, that's nice. That's a great idea. And that's about, as far as
That's
the
as far as you get.
conversation goes, And so, yeah, I'm inspired, David. I might have to take a few more notes as you're speaking.
Peter's going to send you a copy of my book. And
Okay, perfect.
since he
Excellent.
and Yvonne were the critical other parts to the creation of the book, we should make sure we get you a copy.
Yeah, we
Okay.
Marketplace
put a few
market.
commas in and did some illustrations and.
Yeah, right. And made sure I did my homework more. Um,
Mm.
but it was really we did when COVID started. Yvonne and Peter and I said, "What are you going to do now?" And we said, "Let's write a book." And so the three of us, along with Tori from our team, and we spent the first few months of COVID writing about the marketplace revolution, so we could get the story shared, and it became part of podcasts. But it's really still the story I think we're talking about, Peter.
Well, maybe it'd be a thing for us to put a call out to folks in Brantford who are aware of other social enterprises. Perhaps if anyone in a municipality or a large organization who is purchasing services that you'd consider purchasing from a social enterprise, maybe we just invite that in and have a conversation and maybe connect the ecosystem a little bit around that and see what Burbally is. Because as David said, I think of your community benefit agreements too, David, and some of the community efforts that were launched to bring that form into a way to bring more attention and resources into some of the questions that people wanted to address. They're all community led. So now there's I think one of the contributions of what you've done with social procurement and your colleagues at Bisocial Canada is that there's now a policy framework that can dovetail with grassroots activity. And I think sometimes there's a ceiling we hit with grassroots if the policies aren't set up to invite receptivity on the part of partners that could actually make the thing happen. So, and one of the other interesting things in the social procurement journey was that we were hearing that people who were in accounting offices, which consider themselves as keeping the accounts and in the back office, suddenly became front room activists because we can now. That's a real shift in personal ethos, and probably a surprising gestalt for many to realize that I can do good with what I'm doing here in this back office and keeping accounts.
And that's contagious too, right?
Right.
I mean, honestly, you start it and, it's like, I want on that bus.
Right on.
Yeah.
So maybe we've got a few minutes left. I thought maybe we could pivot a little bit to Laurie and this tiny homes movement that's afoot in Brant and Brantford.
Which sounds like is the community hub to start talking about social impact.
Well, it could be, right? Right. It could be. So I guess a bit of the story there is, and I kind of hesitate to talk about people who aren't here, but I have to give a shout out to Jocelyn Burks from Belonging Brant, because Jocelyn's become a bit of a firebrand in community around this. She had been spending time with a gentleman who lives in the streets, and they got talking about possibilities, and that inspired Jocelyn to host a community summit. I think you were part of that, and if Risha from Community Living Brant at the time, we co-convened this community summit, and then another one, and the group whittled its way down to saying, let's look at creating community capacity for tiny homes and accessory dwelling builds in community. And we've been at it for a while, and we're kind of having some fun. What would you say is the latest news on that front, Laurie? Or maybe the thing that's been most exciting recently?
Well, having the actual design in our hands was really exciting. So it makes it so much more real when you actually see a place where somebody can live. I think the most exciting part is how it's grown very organically. The right people in the conversation at the right time. So many gifts shared that just made progress every time we talked. So for me, that was, I think, is my most exciting part about it. I mean, and now we're at the point where funding is where we're at, which usually has a really big big stop sign, right? So, we're talking about a lot of different options. We have a very talented grant writing team, and so that's kind of where we're at right now. But just having those drawings and getting this far just makes it feel so much more real that we're actually going to start something that is a precedent in our city anyways. Like no one's done this yet. So yeah.
Yeah, and just to share a bit of context, when we started, I don't know, has it been a year yet? I don't even know.
Since I think June was the summit.
June of last year. Yeah. Okay, so it's been about a year, and it was just an idea, and there was a lot of frustration around the table. With there's lots of talk about this stuff. There's been all kinds of committees and all kinds of things, meetings, gatherings, and we're not moving. So there was this sort of like pent up desire to take agency and make things happen. But since then, so there have been some pretty big shifts, including, speaking of policy, Government of Ontario policy that is pretty much demanding that municipalities make it possible to build more of these accessory dwellings on properties,
Yes.
And cleared up a lot of the red tape. And Laura, you have how many homes at Jaycee Homes that might suit for accessory dwellings?
Well, we have a total of 83 properties, and we just actually finished our unit inspections, and we're kind of examining how many backyards we can use. But I would probably say that we've got 25 to 40 that we could actually build accessory dwellings on. So.
And this first one, it's a larger property.
Yes. Yeah. This is. I mean, this one's going to be building 2 nice big units, right? So one that has a 2-bedroom unit, and then another one that's just 1 bedroom. So it's a pie-shaped lot. So we're able to use the back footage to really take advantage of this. So it'll be great kind of to prototype that. So then depending on what kind of space we have, we can plop a 2-bedroom or a 1-bedroom on another property. Is my selfish goal with, as you know, as a representative of Jaycee Homes. But the bigger picture, hopefully, is to motivate homeowners and property owners that can actually be part of the solution at a very easy way. So
right on. And that's one of the things that we're seeing develop too. Like we're lucky that you're here and Jaycee Homes is willing to entertain putting accessory dwellings on properties you already have. And in the process, we've now attracted, I think, 90. So the working circle meets every 2 weeks. It's an open and permeable boundary. We keep no minutes, and there's no agenda. We've sort of held to the notion that committees are the long, dark alleys into which the best of ideas are lured there to be slowly strangled to death. So we don't behave like that at all. And as a result, we've seen 90 folks come in and out. What's the business Cody's in? It's not pallets.
Pallets. Yeah,
it is pallets. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So Cody dropped in the middle of a meeting in his car and just opened up a whole new arena for things that could be done around temporary dwellings as a stepping stone to more permanent dwellings.
And green roofs.
And green roofs also. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. So he was a bit of a free radical showing up and shaking things up. There's we've had to wrestle with the matching of residents to providers of homes, with care concerns, support concerns in mind, cultural fit, age fit, accessibility fit. So we're looking at all this massive stuff and working it through, right?
Yeah, and working within that community because it's going to be a close knit of 3 units. So, yeah, right. And I mean the housing continuum is so diverse, and there's we really had to decide who we were going to serve on that continuum, because
for those 2 homes. Whereas in the meantime, with members from the city have shown up, people from nonprofits have shown up, friendship centers people have come from friendship centers.
The Chamber of Commerce.
So it's really interesting. Chamber of Commerce, even David seems pretty enthusiastic about all of this stuff. So just to see the variety and diversity of people who show up organically.
Yeah, we've had some representatives of the accessibility point of we've had Indigenous communities show up. So there's been it's a very excellent melting pot of our community, 100%. So now we just have to. Oh, sorry. We just have to get this conversation over that hump of action, right? And so that's where we're going now.
Right. And we've had someone come to our working circle who bought a tiny home.
Yes.
And then moved it and leased the land. So there's all these different ways to buy, own, rent, lease, finance, all that. What you called it? Lasagna
Lasagna,
finance. Yeah.
lasagna funding. Yes. Yes. Yeah, definitely lasagna funding.
And there, I can see. I don't know, David. Can you see a social procurement application to the building of tiny homes and accessory dwellings?
Right. I can see the creation of a social enterprise that is a construction company that builds.
Right on.
And
Right
then
on.
we take the examples from what Sean Lonnie has done with Aki Energy and Aki Construction, and we look at like build and we look at impact construction in St. John's and building up. How do you use that construction to create job training to get some young people into the construction trades? Because one of the things that we're learning is when you grow up in poverty, you don't have access to things like hammers and tapes and skill saws and simple things that we would assume growing up in a privileged community. You know how to use those tools when
That's
you're
right.
17 or 18. Well, if you grew up in poverty or in a difficult situation, those were never part of the household.
Mm-mm.
So
That's
then
right.
someone says, well, there's this job, it pays $30 an hour. You just need to have $150 worth of work boots and clothing and all those things to get to the job site. Then you need a couple $100 worth of tools. Oh, and you need to know how to use those tools. Well, if there's no path from point zero to that $30 an hour job, supportive path, then it's not going to work. So you take
Mm,
what you're doing, Laurie, and you say, okay, we've got 5 to 10 years of construction, you know, you can learn how to build a wall. You can learn how to use these tools. You can learn how to paint. You can learn how to do landscaping. And if it becomes like a social enterprise with supportive employment built into it, you are creating jobs and creating community and building that capacity. And for the construction companies in Brantford who are probably all looking for good workers. You're doing the screening and the training. So
Hmm.
all of a sudden now you've got a construction company that says, you tell me. I mean, there's a great story I can share from St. Paul's Hospital. Embers is a social enterprise that places
hmm
people in
hmm
temporary work. And at the hospital, they needed security, not security like carrying guns and chasing people, but check the badges that everyone coming on site belongs here. So Embers placed an Indigenous woman in the job, and she was there for a couple weeks. And 2 weeks after she was on, PCL, the construction company, called up Embers and said, could you please send someone to replace the security person tomorrow? And of course, Embers goes like catches her breath and said, "Oh, did it not work out? What happened?" She says, "Oh, it's great. We just brought her onto our apprenticeship program in carpentry. She was so good." They would never have met that Indigenous woman
hmm
without
Right.
hmm
that step into it. So you start to look at what you're doing, Laurie, and you start to look at it as part of the whole system of how do you create jobs and skills in an inclusive community. Like you said, the Friendship Center came. Well, they probably have a youth program.
hmm
Yeah.
And they probably have
They
a
do,
youth
yeah.
they probably have an employment training program, and somebody
hmm
else
hmm
probably, like the college, might have an indigenous carpentry program or masonry program or plumbing program or electric program. So all of a sudden, your tiny homes are not just tiny homes for the resident; they're part of community. I was trying to tell that to a construction company who's we were working with them, and I said, "Oh, I saw you're building a school in my neighborhood." And they said, "Oh yeah, that project, they should have just tore because it was like fixing it up for earthquake prevention." They said, "Well, it's just a real pain of a problem." And I said, "Yeah, but it's a school." They said, "Yeah, yeah, it's going to be done. We'll get there on time. It'll be ready for next." I said, "It's a school in my neighborhood. It's got a library. Children are going to be there. Families are going to," and they had looked at it as it's a structure. It's not
Yeah.
what you're doing are
hmm
not building structures. You're building community. And when you start to take every tiny home and say, that's a way to build community capital, you
Yeah.
know, then all of a sudden it becomes a community project. It doesn't become like, oh, that's what we're doing for those people. It's like, no, that's what we're doing to build community. It's creating jobs, it's creating training, and all those people. And then you're starting to look at, oh, if someone has stable housing, the healthcare goes down, and
Yes.
then the police intervention goes down. And so you're really building community one tiny house at a time.
Yes, I'm thinking about this as you're talking, and I already have a title for this social enterprise. We're going to call it Building Better.
Nice.
Good.
Nice.
And there's some great models, Laurie. I think our colleague Sean Lonnie has been so instrumental in taking the construction industry and leveraging it. You look at building up in Toronto, you look at community builders in Barrie, and you look at impact construction in St. John's, build in Winnipeg. It's really such a great industry because the jobs pay well. There's lots of they're short 300,000 workers, and half their employees are retiring in the next 10 years. So, and it's everything. It's from office work to bidding. It's so it's not just like you have to be technical. It's
Right.
like all the other
And
pieces too.
and Laurie, do you still have a build you're pursuing with
Yes.
JC Homes?
Yes,
You
we
do.
are.
Okay.
It's still alive,
All right.
barely.
And that's a significant project in and of itself, right? So I wonder
Yeah.
what are the parameters for that build?
It's a 24 unit affordable housing project that has a commercial space in the bottom where I'm hoping to put a community hub in there so that we can do training, like maybe, I don't know what, but any kind of training. And then also my social enterprise idea is a laundromat cafe. The building is for women and women-led families that are fleeing domestic violence, and I'm hoping that this would give them an opportunity if they need job experience or a way to subsidize their rent. So yeah, that's the project at hand. We're this close now to finalizing funding, so our permit has been approved, and we can put the shovel in the ground as soon as the check gets written.
Right on. Right.
Yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah. So it's almost exciting.
Yeah,
Almost exciting.
and it's also when you look at that opportunity, like the procurement while you're building, the procurement after, like you do property management, so you know there's entry level jobs, there's skilled jobs, there's all the purchasing. How do you make the purchasing? Where do you do it? So even in what you do is so it's so fascinating because you're already doing social procurement. I mean, when you talk about we're building a building with the purpose of supporting,
Yes.
women, and you're doing that's social procurement, that's social enterprise. So I think that's where we have to start realizing that this isn't something new. It's what people in communities have been
Mm-hmm.
doing. This just not the it's just we want to move it from being on that little edge to this is what is normal, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when does social procurement become procurement?
Right.
Right. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, we're almost at time. So what I thought we might do is just work through a closing round of, as we've been together, what stood out for you, or what meaning was made for you during our time together.
Well, I have to say that I am very inspired. Thank you, David, for the work that you do, and Peter, I mean, for inviting me. I feel like it's a conversation that has to become louder. So I'm
Mm,
hoping that maybe, yeah, that I'm pretty good at conversation. So maybe that's where I'm going to start as far as, making this more of a normal idea. And you're right, David, it is something that we do. I mean, I go as far as some of my tenants have talents as far as contracting goes. So I hire my tenants to do our floors and our painting, right? And I think that circle of community and buy-in is really important. So yeah, I'm very motivated once again.
right
Yeah.
on. Thank you.
And I think, Peter, you should be congratulated because you're making the conversation louder.
Yes,
You've already, no,
absolutely.
if you already, Laurie said that's what we
Right
should be
on,
doing.
yeah.
You're already on it, Peter. And I actually, Laurie, I'm just totally inspired because I've been to Brantford. My wife grew up in Brantford,
Oh, wow.
so um, it's it's one of those changing communities that really needs people like you to move it from what had been that traditional. We're, got some big factories here that make farm equipment,
Hmm.
uh, to where my father-in-law worked, and to now it's like, okay, what, we're not going to be a bedroom community. We want to be a community, and so it's going to take people like you, like what you're doing, to build community with something more than we're a property company, we're a builder, and we're looking for how do we maximize profit. You're doing the work, so I'm totally inspired.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I have to say, my mind's a bit boggled uh, by the tremendous amount of work that is being done, and we're not just floating in the clouds here. Like, this conversation is rich with on the ground, practicable, community based solutions that are being met with a policy framework that's likely to be more responsive and flow more resources and possibility into those localized grassroots responses to the problems and possibilities that we see.
Hmm.
And this is three of us and what we're in touch with. Extraordinary. Extraordinary.
Absolutely.
All right.
You got
Well,
the challenge, Peter. Make the conversation louder.
well, we'll give it a whirl, hey? We'll give it a whirl.
Ax, Laurie just gave you Axiom, your new tagline.
Making the conversation louder. That'd be an ethos shift for us. I'd be willing to give it a try. Stop this quiet voice nonsense and speak more loudly. Ask more provocative questions. Yeah.
Mm.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. I hope we can have you back again sometime to hear. Part of the idea here is to check in every once in a while so that folks can travel along with us as things unfold. We're not looking for the big story that's going to win all the awards. We're looking for all the little ones that are going to add up to a generative and paradigm shifting narrative over time by weaving them all together. So thanks again to both of you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks so
All
much.
right. Okay. Thank you. You're welcome. So that's our show for today. If you would like to continue to follow along, you can subscribe to our live channel on YouTube, or you can find us at axiomnews.com and Axiom News on Facebook and on Twitter. So that's our show for now. I'm your host, Peter Pula. Thank you for listening.